Beneath the sand of Arabia lies a chain of ancient megastructures so vast, so precise, and so old that every supposed explanation only opens further questions. In AlUla and Madain, entire cliff faces were carved with astonishing accuracy, yet the people who shaped them left almost no trace. Across Eric K-Bar, thousands of stone structures spread across the landscape in patterns no known civilization claimed. At Tame, royal inscriptions appear without the urban scale one would expect to sustain such authority. And in Dumet al-Jandal and Alfa, layers of ruins refuse to align with the timelines preserved in our textbooks. Scattered across Juba, rock art depicts animals, environments, and rituals that do not sit comfortably within any known cultural sequence. Who built these desert strongholds? Why do their architectural histories contradict the civilizations assumed to have lived there? How could such large-scale construction be organized in regions long considered empty? And what vanished story connects these fragments? AlUla, in the northwestern desert, is a landscape that seems shaped by time itself. Its sandstone plateaus carry the softened geometry of a place inhabited far longer than any written memory. As morning light touches the cliffs, ancient pathways and abandoned dwellings reveal themselves, hinting at a settlement that once anchored caravans moving between distant kingdoms. From afar it seems like a simple oasis town of antiquity, but closer study reveals a depth of continuity that does not announce itself plainly. Subtle signs, Bronze Age enclosures, pattern arrangements of wells, alignments of structures pointing toward star positions that have since shifted, suggest history's richer and more layered than traditional narratives allow. Archaeologists trace habitation in the region back many millennia, shaped by groundwater systems, sediment flows, and bedrock channels that sustained early pastoralists as well as later Dedanite and Lihainite polities. Yet contradictions accumulate as the evidence grows. Radiocarbon dates do not always match pottery styles. Certain monumental features appear reworked across multiple eras, obscuring their origins. Well-known carved facades coexist with inscriptions that fit no clear stylistic lineage, their motifs echoing neighboring cultures while the tool marks remain distinctively local. Such discrepancies hint at workshops that move with trade routes or artisans adapting older, now lost traditions. Throughout the area, traces of administrative, ritual, and commercial structures point to a community positioned between Arabia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. But the spatial logic is uneven. Some quarters show deliberate planning, while others seem layered atop earlier layouts, suggesting repeated cycles of abandonment and reoccupation. Subsurface surveys reveal foundations that do not match later street grids and terraces filled with reused stones from buildings whose original locations are unknown. Inscriptions in Dadanitic, Thamudic, and other scripts mark presence without providing narrative continuity, yet their sheer density implies a social world in which marking place mattered deeply. Ancient water channels carved into bedrock display engineering knowledge, refined over centuries, but their sequence of repairs and modifications makes it difficult to distinguish origin from maintenance. In some areas, unusually deep sediment covers early structures, hinting at large-scale regrading or flood management events unrecorded in surviving texts. Even the monumental tombs, often linked to Nabatean influence, complicate rather than clarify chronology. Photogrammetry reveals chisel patterns inconsistent with known Nabatean tools, suggesting local craftsmen borrowed external forms, but executed them through region-specific techniques, producing hybrids that resist easy classification. Small finds, beads, seeds, imported ceramics, reflect fluctuating trade networks, their sporadic appearance mirroring broader shifts in economic rhythms. Geological studies show how tectonic uplift, rainfall changes, and shifting dunes alter water availability, complicating any attempt to correlate environmental shifts with settlement patterns. Pollen cores reveal cycles of cultivation and decline, but these do not always correspond neatly with archaeological horizons. Gaps persist. Phases of occupation that elude detection, fleeting groups that left no clear imprint, transitions that neither artifact nor sediment fully explains. South of AlUla lies Madain, where broad sandstone massifs rise above pale gravel plains. Its carved monuments stand in quiet symmetry, as if awaiting the community that once animated them. At first, the facades resemble those of Petra, grand tombs, monumental stairways, ornamented entrances following recognizable Nabatean patterns. But closer inspection, reveals a more complex story. Irregular orientations and spacing appear where cliff angles or soft stone force builders to adjust their plans. Unfinished tombs and abandoned outlines show attempts to adapt designs to geological constraints, revealing a continuous negotiation between architectural intent and the possibilities of the rock. Inscriptions on some facades offer names and boundaries, but little about why this caravan station flourished when it did, or how its clusters of tombs correspond to regional shifts in Nabatean power. Excavations of surrounding habitation zones reveal unexpected sparsity, especially given the density of monumental burial structures. The daily life that supported such architectural ambition remains elusive. Pottery, tools, and imported goods show connections stretching deep into Arabia and north to Levant, but their distribution fluctuates sharply. Some layers contain abundant foreign wares, while others hardly show any, suggesting seasonal occupation, shifting caravan routes, or cycles of prosperity and decline. Geological surveys further complicate matters, revealing subtle changes in the landscape that may have affected water access and settlement stability. The result is a site that feels at once familiar and enigmatic, rooted in known cultural frameworks, yet shaped by forces and decisions that remain partly invisible. Across these deserts, the ancient story of northern Arabia is not one of lost civilizations performing impossible feats, but of long, layered histories that do not fit neatly into the categories we have inherited. The ambiguity persists not because the past is unknowable, but because its traces were shaped by many hands, many adaptations, and many forgotten turns. What remains invites wonder not through mystery alone, but through the quiet recognition that deep time leaves room for both clarity and uncertainty, and that the desert still holds stories not yet fully told. The sandstone here belongs to a formation whose bedding planes shift markedly even over short distances, making every carved facade a negotiation between artisan and rock. Variations in weathering, especially around cornices and engaged columns, hint at construction phases that may have been separated by more time than stylistic continuity suggests. Even the grandest tombs, with sharply cut pediments and finely worked capitals, do not resolve the question of how labor was organized, whether master builders circulated through the region, or whether distinctive chisel signatures represent workshops otherwise lost to history. None of these uncertainties stray beyond the usual ambiguity expected in a landscape where written records are scarce, but together they create a layered, unresolved picture. Beyond the main clusters, scattered quarries and half-carved blocks point to industrial zones that once supplied construction efforts. Yet debris patterns do not always match nearby tombs, suggesting that stone may have been moved farther than assumed, or that certain quarrying episodes serve multiple building phases whose order is still unclear. Nabatean influence is unmistakable, but subtle departures in proportion and ornament, localized versions of crow-step motifs, slight adjustments in column spacing, show how imported styles were reshaped by practical demands and regional preferences. Cultural transmission rarely produces perfect replicas, and here the architectural language reflects a blend of familiarity and adaptation. Beneath the carved monuments, traces of earlier habitation complicate the sequence further. Hearths, storage pits, and post holes mark communities that predate the monumental phase, though their relationship to later Nabatean builders remains uncertain. Some ceramic traditions appear to break sharply between periods, while others evolve gradually, creating a palimpsest of cultural continuity and change. Environmental studies add their own dimension. Shifts in aquifer levels and episodic rainfall variations may have influenced agricultural potential nearby, shaping cycles of prosperity, decline, and reoccupation. But the timing of these environmental proxies rarely aligns perfectly with archaeological layers, leaving space for multiple interpretations. As researchers refine their mapping of the site, they encounter anomalies, alignments without clear function, clusters of small features whose purposes remain debated, and unexpected gaps in areas where denser activity might be predicted. None of this points to anything extraordinary. Rather, it highlights the limitations of reconstructing a long, complex past from a fragmentary record. The facades of Madain Salih, monumental yet quiet, display precision without revealing the full sequence of decisions, adaptations, and forgotten moments that shaped them. They stand not as relics of a lost or unknown civilization, but as cumulative works of cultures navigating terrain, climate, and shifting circumstances. Their clarity lies in form. Their ambiguity persists in chronology. East of AlUla's Central Valley, where isolated sandstone buttes rise like solitary markers of deep time, Elephant Rock stands apart. Its wide arch and rounded contours were sculpted by wind-driven abrasion and long cycles of expansion and contraction, long before humans arrived. At a distance, it seems entirely natural, a geological accident given a recognizable silhouette by erosion. But near its base, faint incisions and weathered petroglyphs appear, shallow lines blurred by centuries of sand-laden winds, suggesting that this formation once carried meaning beyond its dramatic shape. These carvings, modest compared to facades at Madain Salih, include figures of animals, tribal signs, and occasional inscriptions of varying legibility. Though few offer clear dates, stylistic parallels across northern Arabia imply that multiple groups left their marks over long intervals, producing a layered record of fleeting encounters. Surveys around the butte reveal lithic scatters, hearth traces, and outlines of temporary camps, indicating that the site functioned as a waypoint or gathering place rather than a permanent settlement. Yet the uneven distribution of features leaves open whether Elephant Rock was a territorial marker, a ritual locale, or simply a memorable landmark in shifting desert routes. The carvings complicate interpretation. Some depict familiar motifs, ibex, camels, simple human figures, while others faintly resemble styles from distant regions, though such connections remain tentative and likely reflect broad traditions rather than direct contact. Microerosion dating yields wide chronological ranges that overlap multiple cultural periods, making it difficult to determine whether carvings represent brief visits or recurring engagements. Uneven erosion across a formation means that some carvings weathered faster than others, potentially giving a misleading sense of relative age based on exposure rather than chronology. Though modest in scale, the cumulative marking suggests that Elephant Rock drew repeated attention, perhaps due to its prominence, its position along travel routes, or even the subtle acoustics created by the arch, an effect noted in modern field reports though unverified archaeologically. Low stone rings, simple alignments, and scattered cairns in the vicinity add complexity. Such features elsewhere in Arabia served various roles: herding management, wayfinding, symbolic marking. Yet without stratigraphy, their purpose here remains uncertain. Environmental reconstructions indicate that past conditions may have supported more vegetation than today, with ephemeral grasslands attracting pastoral groups whose seasonal movements intersected with the landmark. But these reconstructions offer broad parameters rather than precise narratives. While the formation shape encourages modern symbolic interpretations, the archaeological record provides no firm basis for assigning ritual meaning. The carvings instead reflect everyday motifs common across the peninsula. Ceramics found nearby span multiple periods, from early Arabian wares to later Islamic pieces, but their sparse distribution supports the idea of transient activity rather than settled life. Ongoing documentation reveals further irregularities: grid-like scars that could be tool marks or natural exfoliation, clusters of lines inconsistent with prevailing styles, and a partially buried boulder with carvings unlike those on the main rock. None of these details signal extraordinary phenomena. They simply emphasize how much remains uncertain in a landscape shaped by natural forces and intermittent human presence. Limited excavation, necessary to preserve the landmark and its fragile surroundings, leaves many questions unresolved about how and when people interacted with this striking geological witness across centuries. Ultimately, Elephant Rock endures as a quiet merging of geological time and human touch. Its shape formed over millions of years, its markings added in scattered moments across millennia, leaving behind a subdued record whose meaning rests not in monumental expression, but in the faint gestures of travelers, herders, and small communities who pause long enough to inscribe their presence onto an already ancient surface. What remains is not a dramatic mystery, but a gentle uncertainty shaped by the interplay between enduring stone and the nearly erased intentions of those who carved their brief marks upon it. In the broad basin of northern Arabia, where shifting dunes meet low basalt ridges, the Tema Oasis appears as a constellation of wells, settlement mounds, and worn walls whose quiet presence understates the depth of its history. At first, the ruins seem like the ordinary remnants of an oasis town built on trade and agriculture, their mud bricks softened by wind and occasional floods. But closer to defensive walls and the tall, solitary Tema stone, with its Aramaic inscription, the atmosphere deepens. The Oasis emerges not only as a caravan stop, but at times as a political refuge, a commercial hub, and a meeting place for traditions moving between the Levant and Inner Arabia. Archaeological layers extend into Bronze Age, and the stratified deposits beneath later architecture reveal shifts in food production, storage, and ceramic style that form a sequence more intricate than the open desert setting suggests. Yet these transitions are uneven, with abrupt changes that do not always correspond to known regional events, leaving open the possibility of demographic movements, climate fluctuations, or economic adjustments that left incomplete signatures in the material record. The Oasis owed its longevity to deep wells drawing from ancient aquifers. Paleohydrological studies, however, show that groundwater levels fluctuated, and these oscillations may have shaped cycles of settlement growth and decline. Paradoxically, some construction surges appear to coincide with periods of reduced water, suggesting responses mediated by social adaptation rather than environmental stability alone. Remnants of massive city walls rise in irregular tiers of stone and mud brick, their foundations built atop earlier fortifications of differing techniques, pointing to long-term modification rather than a single planned effort. Subtle deviations in alignment imply that builders incorporated older structures or shifted priorities over time. Pottery from around the walls reflects far-reaching trade from the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, and Mesopotamia, though the quantity of foreign imports varies unpredictably, complicating attempts to situate Tama within broader commercial networks. The historical episode of the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus residing at Tama further complicates interpretation. While texts confirm his stay, the archaeological remains linked to this period are diffuse, lacking an identifiable royal complex, and offering only scattered objects datable to his reign. This mismatch has prompted a reconsideration of assumptions about how royal occupation manifested in an oasis context. Within residential quarters, excavations uncover multi-room houses, storage areas, and workshops indicating a stable urban community, though later renovations obscure earlier patterns, making it difficult to trace clear social or architectural development. Collapsed walls left unrepaired in certain areas suggest localized abandonment episodes that do not fully align with the broader occupation sequence. Small finds, seal impressions, plaster fragments, botanical remains give glimpses into administration and daily life, but often raise new questions. Some seal motifs resemble styles from distant regions. Others appear locally made but stylistically unusual, and the distribution of imported plant remains implies trade networks whose precise origins remain unclear. Geological studies indicate that shifting dunes periodically encroached upon cultivated zones, forcing adjustments in irrigation and settlement layout, though synchronizing dune movement with archaeological phases remains challenging. Isolated stone structures, cairns, alignments, low enclosures, introduce another layer of ambiguity. Their functions range from burials to boundaries to pastoral installations, but erosion and scarce datable material leave most interpretations tentative. Inscriptions across the region in Aramaic, Lyhionite, and other scripts reflect Tama's cultural fluidity, but rarely provide broader narrative context, producing gaps between written evidence and material remains. Remote sensing reveals additional uncertainties. Rectilinear shadows beneath the sand, outlines of large compounds, subsurface channels diverging from visible wells. None point to anything extraordinary. They simply show how much of Tama's infrastructure remains hidden or transformed by centuries of reuse and natural deposition. Even the Tama stone, despite its linguistic importance, stands as a solitary text whose significance is limited by the scarcity of related inscriptions. Thus, the oasis emerges as a mosaic of partial histories, hydrological, commercial, political, domestic, each preserved clearly enough to suggest its presence but rarely enough to define its sequence. What appears as a subtle enigma shaped by cycles of adaptation, movement, and environmental negotiation, leaving a lingering curiosity not built on dramatic unknowns, but on the quiet complexities that shaped an oasis whose continuity outlived many of the forces that once defined it. Across the dark volcanic expanse of Erik Kabar, where basalt flows spread in uneven sheets and extinct cones rise like silent watchtowers, the landscape first appears purely geological, forged by eruptions over hundreds of thousands of years, yet scattered across the lava domes and fractured plateaus like countless human-made stone structures. keyhole-shaped monuments, circular cairns, low alignments, and the long converging walls of desert kites. Their persistent presence interrupts the impression of untouched terrain and reveals a human imprint stretched across millennia of environmental change. What initially seemed like simple pastoral or hunting installations grow increasingly complex as researchers map their distribution. Patterns emerge, structures following topographical lines, seasonal watercourses, and vantage points across the basalt field, indicating coordinated activity rather than isolated effort. Yet the sequence of construction remains blurry. Radiocarbon dates yield broad, overlapping ranges, making it difficult to establish a clear timeline. The density of features suggests intense ancient activity, though the purpose varies widely. Desert kites, with their long guiding walls leading into enclosed pits, point to collective hunting systems practiced across northern Arabia. Keyhole-shaped monuments, with circular mounds and tapering tails, appear commemorative or symbolic, though their meaning is uncertain due to minimal associated artifacts. Geology adds further complexity. Basalt preserves structures unevenly depending on weathering patterns, making some appear younger than they are, while others nearly disappear beneath thin layers of wind-blown sediment. In places where later lava flows overlapped earlier surfaces, ancient installations may be partially or entirely obscured. Excavations reveal sparse clues, charcoal, animal bone fragments, scattered lithics, but these seldom clarify the full story. Some keyhole monuments contain burials while others do not. Some kites show signs of repeated use, while others appear abandoned early, suggesting that various groups use a landscape differently. Their identity is difficult to distinguish through material culture alone. Harat Kebar thus emerges as another quiet puzzle of northern Arabia, a volcanic field carrying the traces of many hands, many purposes, and many moments of human presence, each partly preserved, partly erased, and collectively hinting at histories still only faintly understood. The placement of these features often corresponds to subtle environmental cues: breaks in the lava crust, vantage points overlooking pastures, and natural pathways that would have guided herds or wild game during seasonal migrations. But whether these alignments reflect deliberate planning or practical adaptation remains uncertain, especially since ethnographic parallels from later periods offer only imperfect analogies. As remote sensing expands a catalog of visible structures through satellite imagery, aerial photography, and drone mapping, new configurations appear whose purposes remain debated. Circular clusters that might mark temporary habitations or ritual gatherings, long walls that end abruptly without clear enclosures, and geometric forms whose meaning has been lost through erosion or partial preservation. Nothing in these findings suggests anything extraordinary, but together they emphasize how difficult it is to reconstruct the specific intentions of ancient builders who worked in a vast, shifting environment. The basalt's tendency to fracture unpredictably introduces further ambiguity, for natural formations can resemble human-made shapes. Distinguishing deliberate alignments from incidental rock patterns requires careful field verification, often leading to revised interpretations of structures once thought to be extensive building complexes, but now understood as partly natural formations modified or adapted by human activity. Environmental research shows that during certain prehistoric periods the region experienced higher rainfall, supporting vegetation and wildlife that would have sustained mobile pastoral groups. Yet the timing of these wetter intervals is broad, making it difficult to link specific construction phases to specific environmental conditions. It is likely, however, that some monuments were built when the landscape was more hospitable than it is today. Fragments of rock art around the margins of the lava field, animal figures, abstract lines, occasional inscriptions, hint at intermittent cultural interaction with neighboring regions. Yet these markings are too few and varied to form a continuous narrative, and their dating often rests on stylistic comparison rather than firm chronology. In some areas, keyhole structures cluster around older cairns or intersect with desert kites, suggesting layers of reuse or reinterpretation. But the motivations behind such sequences remain unknown, without associated settlements to clarify shifting ritual or social practices. The scarcity of habitation debris across the Sahara indicates that the area was used primarily as a specialized activity zone, perhaps for hunting, seasonal pastoralism, or commemorative practices, rather than as a densely inhabited landscape. Even so, The scale of installations implies coordinated group efforts that do not easily reconcile with the sparse domestic record. Occasional anomalies, stone rings lacking entrances, tail-like extensions detached from circular mounds, long walls that seem to lead nowhere, do not point to unknown civilizations. Instead, they illustrate how partial preservation, later modification, and geological interference can obscure original configurations, leaving present-day researchers to interpret a record shaped as much by absence as by what survives. In the end, Harak K-Bar stone landscape forms a wide, quiet archive of practical and symbolic activity spread across a terrain molded by volcanic forces. Each structure offers a fragment of insight into how ancient communities interacted with this formidable environment, yet none provides a full account, leaving a subdued but enduring sense of inquiry grounded in the understated complexity of a place where human intention and geological immensity overlap. In the far north of Arabia, where limestone ridges taper into gravel plains and wind funnels through narrow passages between ancient walls, Dumet al-Jandal rises from its layered tell as a settlement shaped by Oasis life and shifting political boundaries. Its most prominent structures, the imposing chasm mirror with its stepped silhouette and the nearby early Islamic mosque, give the impression of a fortified town supported by water and long-distance trade. But beneath these visible monuments lie earlier layers, some dating to the Iron Age or before, defined by foundations that do not always align with later street grids. These subtle misalignments complicate the idea of a smooth urban evolution, revealing a settlement repeatedly reshaped across centuries. Excavations show wells, storage pits, and mud brick walls accumulating in successive layers that suggest long-term habitation, yet the sequence is uneven. Abrupt shifts in ceramics and food remains do not always correspond to known regional upheavals, hinting at demographic changes, trade redirections, or internal reorganizations whose causes remain partly hidden. Environmental evidence indicates fluctuations in water availability, though the timing rarely matches architectural phases cleanly. Some construction booms coincide with drier periods, suggesting that innovations in water management or shifts in social organization may have sustained the community despite environmental stress. Khazar Merit itself, built from limestone blocks laid in irregular courses, embodies this layered complexity. Some sections clearly belong to late pre-Islamic or early Islamic phases, while others display masonry styles that may reflect earlier construction or later repair. Erosion blurs tool marks and collapse mixes stones from different periods, making distinctions difficult. The nearby mosque incorporates reused stones bearing earlier inscriptions, a practical choice that also muddies efforts to trace a clear architectural sequence. Beyond the central complex, surveys reveal scattered dwellings, eroded enclosures, and agricultural installations, suggesting a settlement that expanded and contracted with political and economic shifts. But without continuous textual records, the nature and scale of these shifts remain partly speculative. Inscriptions across the Oasis, various North Arabian scripts and later Arabic forms, provide personal names and transactions but not sustained narratives. They offer glimpses into social organization without revealing the broader forces shaping the town's development. Geological studies show that the Oasis occupies a basin influenced by tectonic uplift and sediment redistribution, processes that altered water channels over time and may have prompted episodes of reoccupation or reconfiguration. Small finds, beads from distant origins, metal objects blending different technological traditions, botanical remains reflecting changing agricultural practices, suggest intermittent participation in wide-ranging networks. Yet these connections appear sporadic, with gaps where expected material correlates are missing. Deeper excavations reveal stone-built structures whose functions are uncertain, perhaps storage, defensive posts, or administrative spaces. Reuse, collapse, and erosion obscure their internal organization, preventing definitive classification. Even the town's fame in historical sources as a frontier stronghold does not align neatly with the archaeological record, which preserves an irregular and incomplete sequence. As mapping continues, subsurface anomalies, possible earlier fortifications, buried water channels, faint outlines of compounds, add detail without resolving the chronology. Dumet al-Jandal thus remains a place where solid monuments anchor its identity, while deeper layers present a quieter, more ambiguous narrative of adaptation and intermittent prominence, suspended between clarity and absence. Deep in the southern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, where the Rub al Khali's dunes loosen into gravel plains and low escarpments, the ancient city of Al-Fa emerges as a quiet spread of foundations, eroded walls, and wind-softened courtyards. At first glance, it appears to be little more than the remains of a long-abandoned desert town. Yet on closer approach, the scale and organization of the settlement reveal a community far more intricately structured than its muted ruins imply. Broad avenues, substantial residences, market spaces, temples, and a vast necropolis show that Al-Fa once held a strategic position along caravan routes linking southern Arabia with central and northern regions. Excavations indicate that the city flourished for several centuries, its prosperity tied to long-distance trade, and its role as a cultural crossroads. Even the earliest architectural phases carry complexities unresolved by the archaeological record. Beneath later buildings lie older alignments that do not match the final street grid, suggesting gradual shifts in planning, adjustments to environmental conditions, or expansions that reshaped earlier districts without fully replacing them. The temple complex, with its thick walls, plastered floors, and collections of ritual objects, provides one of the clearest glimpses into the city's religious life. But these same finds complicate interpretation. For some inscriptions and motifs reflect influences from South Arabian cultures, while others represent local traditions whose origins remain only partly understood. The result is a blend of architectural and artistic expressions not attributable to a single cultural source. Residential quarters contain multi-room stone houses arranged around courtyards, many with workshops, storage silos, and water systems. Planning varies by district. Some areas show careful organization. Others appear more organic, perhaps reflecting demographic changes or fluctuations in economic activity. Small finds, glass shards, beads, metal tools, imported pottery, charred seeds, and textile fragments suggest a thriving economy connected to distant markets. Yet foreign goods appear unevenly across the site, and not always in periods expected to show strong trade connections, raising questions about episodic commerce, storage practices, or distinctions between elite households and the general population. Environmental reconstructions indicate that Al-Fa once occupied a more hospitable landscape, a shallow basin with vegetation supported by wells and channels. But climatic shifts that later reduced water availability remain broadly dated, making it difficult to link environmental decline directly to the city's abandonment. Geological processes have buried or eroded parts of the settlement, meaning that the visible ruins represent only a portion of its original extent. Remote sensing reveals rectilinear shadows beneath the sand, faint outlines of outer structures, and interrupted street segments pointing to a larger footprint. The necropolis, with its variety of tombs, from simple pits to elaborate stone chambers, contains inscriptions and offerings that hint at social identity and belief systems. Yet even here inconsistencies appear. Some burials contain goods that differ stylistically from adjacent tombs, implying long-term variation in funerary practice or the presence of groups whose cultural signatures were unevenly integrated. Inscriptions in ancient South Arabian script, associated with the kingdom of Kinda, provide names, dedications, and administrative snippets, but rarely convey the narrative continuity needed to link architectural phases to specific events. Their uneven distribution raises questions about literacy, authority, and civic organization. Water channels beneath the city show repeated repair and modification, and their stratigraphy indicates fluctuating flow patterns that may have required adjustments in agricultural strategies. The timing of these changes remains difficult to synchronize with broader occupational phases, leaving uncertainty about how resilient the community was to environmental variability. Some of the city's largest buildings remain enigmatic. Massive structures with thick walls and minimal internal divisions that might have served for storage or assembly. Their locations do not always correspond to known administrative areas, and the scarcity of associated artifacts prevents clearer identification. As the site's chronology is refined, inconsistencies between ceramic typologies, radiocarbon dates, and architectural sequences persist. None suggest anything extraordinary, but all illustrate the challenges of reconstructing a long-lived city shaped by gradual change and periodic reconfiguration. Even the reason for Al-Fa's decline remains only partly understood. While diminishing water, shifting trade routes, and regional transitions likely contributed, The archaeological record shows no sudden collapse. Instead, activity dwindled, districts were partially abandoned, and the urban layout slowly dissolved into encroaching sand. Thus, Al stands today as an intricate yet incomplete narrative of an Arabian city whose prosperity and adaptability are evident, but whose internal rhythms and final retreat remain partly obscured. Its quiet gaps sustain curiosity not through dramatic mystery, but through the subtle complexities of settlement once positioned at the crossroads of landscapes, languages, and long-distance exchange. North of the great sandstone escarpment of the Nafud Desert, where ancient lakes once reflected a greener Arabia and winds now shape long ripples across a dry basin, the rock art Juba emerges across towering outcrops and sheltered alcoves as a vast, weathered archive of human presence stretching back tens of thousands of years. At first, the carvings appear as a loose assortment of figures, animals, hunters, geometric marks, etched into stone shaped by cycles of erosion and accretion. But tracing the layers across the vertical faces of Jebel Sinman and surrounding formations reveals a sequence far more intricate than it first seems. Variations in style, technique, and weathering point to different cultural groups visiting or living near the lake when its surroundings supported grasslands, wildlife, and freshwater, allowing communities to thrive whose material traces are otherwise faint. Efforts to situate the earliest carvings rely on superimposition, stylistic comparison, and broader Arabian rock art traditions, but these methods offer ranges rather than precision. The oldest panels, deeply incised images of large bovids and elongated human forms, display weathering consistent with Pleistocene or early Holocene conditions. Without organic material, however, they remain difficult to date confidently, leaving open questions about how artistic activity aligned with periods when the basin hosted animals no longer associated with the desert. Over time, the imagery shifts. Camels, equids, and more standardized human figures appear, pointing to adaptation to changing environments and economies. Yet transitions are uneven. Some panels adopt new motifs abruptly, while others preserve older styles even after environmental evidence suggests major shifts, indicating that artistic change was neither linear nor uniform among the groups who engage with these outcrops. Archaeological work around Juba reveals stone tools, hearths, and ephemeral structures near former lake margins, but their distribution is too scattered to correlate reliably with specific phases of rock art. In many cases, the art remains the primary marker of human activity, even in the absence of a robust settlement record that might clarify cultural identity or social dynamics. Geological processes, exfoliation, mineral streaking, microfracturing, further complicate interpretation by obscuring older engravings and highlighting younger ones, occasionally inverting the apparent sequence when viewed without detailed analysis. Uneven wind erosion can make deeper grooves appear younger, highlighting the need for caution in chronological assessment. The motifs themselves provide insight and ambiguity in equal measure. Scenes of cattle herding and hunting with archers and dogs imply certain subsistence strategies, but these do not always align cleanly with environmental reconstructions. Some images may reflect symbolic or commemorative practices rather than direct records of daily life. Inscriptions in early North Arabian scripts appear on certain panels, providing chronological anchors for Iron Age and later activity. Yet these texts are sparse compared to the sheer breadth of imagery, and their placement atop older carvings emphasizes long-term re-engagement with the same rock surfaces rather than offering a continuous narrative. Across Juba, the carvings form a layered, shifting record shaped by climate, culture, and the persistence of stone, an archive that reveals much about human presence while leaving its deepest rhythms only partly understood. Even the placement of the panels introduces questions. Some of the most elaborate images sit high on ledges now difficult or impossible to reach, implying the use of scaffolding or natural ramps long eroded away. Others cluster in sheltered alcoves where visibility is limited but preservation is stronger, suggesting motivations that may have ranged from public display to ritual privacy to simple practicality, without leaving material evidence to distinguish among them. The wider landscape adds its own complications. Paleo-environmental cores show that Juba's ancient lakes rose and fell dramatically, at times supporting dense vegetation, and at other times shrinking into marshes or disappearing altogether. Yet the relationship between these shifts and the phases of artistic activity remains approximate. Some carvings depicting plentiful wildlife appear on panels that might have been harder to access during wetter periods, while images of desert-adapted animals sometimes overlay surfaces that weathering patterns suggest were exposed during earlier, greener phases. These inconsistencies complicate efforts to draw direct parallels between climate and artistic expression. Scattered anomalies within the rock art record. Figures whose proportions differ markedly from their neighbors, abstract markings that resemble no known regional style, partially erased outlines that could be either unfinished carvings or natural abrasions, do not point to anything extraordinary. They simply demonstrate how incomplete preservation and shifting techniques create interpretive challenges, especially when the surrounding archaeological record offers little contextual support. Modern photogrammetry and high-resolution scanning reveal faint earlier carvings beneath more prominent ones, confirming a long sequence of reuse. Later groups carved over earlier images, not necessarily to obscure them, but possibly to signal continuity of presence or to renew the significance of certain surfaces, though any such intentions remain speculative. Attempt to associate specific clusters with distinct cultural groups, prehistoric hunter-gatherers, early pastoralists, or Oasis communities connected to wider trade networks, remain provisional. The art provides suggestive hints, but the broader archaeological record at Juba is too fragmentary to draw firm cultural lines, and the overlapping styles indicate a landscape visited intermittently rather than continuously occupied. As dunes shift, burying some panels and exposing others, researchers are increasingly aware that the visible record represents only a portion of the artistic activity that once occurred here. Beneath the sand lie buried panels. On exposed faces, eroded traces hint at images that have nearly vanished. Ultimately, the rock art of Juba endures as one of Arabia's most expansive and varied pictorial archives. Its carvings preserve recognizable scenes yet resist precise chronology. They mark a basin repeatedly revisited across changing climates, a place where humans return to inscribe their presence on stone older than any of their histories. What remains is a layered tapestry of memory and landscape, vivid yet never fully resolved. South of the windswept approaches to the Wadi ad-Dawasser Basin, where low escarpments and gravel plains soften into the threshold of the empty quarter, the tombs of Kiryat Al-Fal lie scattered in muted clusters of stone and sand. At first, these structures appear to be peripheral remnants of a prosperous ancient city whose commercial and ritual center once stood nearby. But as one approaches a necropolis, its understated complexity becomes clear. Eroded walls, collapsed roofs, and subtle shifts in the orientation of tombs emerge in the dunes, revealing a mortuary landscape formed through prolonged, episodic construction rather than a single planned effort. Excavations within selected tombs uncover layers of bone, ceramics, beads, and organic remains that do not always align neatly with the architecture of their enclosing structures. This suggests that older forms were repurposed or expanded, and that later generations adapted inherited traditions in flexible ways. Radiocarbon dates, ceramic typologies, and small epigraphic fragments point to a long temporal span. Yet these anchors occasionally contradict expected stylistic sequences. Elaborately built tombs sometimes yield earlier dates than simpler nearby structures. Rather than implying anything extraordinary, such findings underscore the effects of social variability, preservation bias, or reoccupation. Inscriptions in ancient South Arabian script provide personal names and dedications, hinting at identity and lineage, though they remain isolated rather than forming a continuous narrative. Their presence highlights connections between the necropolis and the broader society of Al-Fal, yet the full relationship remains only partially visible. Geological studies show that shifting sediments and migrating dunes have altered the topography, burying some tombs up to their lintels, while leaving others exposed. This uneven preservation complicates mapping the cemetery's original extent. Structures that appear distinct today may once have belonged to larger complexes connected by walls or pathways now erased. Construction techniques vary widely. Some tombs feature carefully dressed stone and entrances framed by slabs that once held plaster or pigment, while others rely on simple rubble. These differences may reflect social standing, available resources, or changing architectural norms, though collapse and disturbance often blur the original distinctions. Human remains reveal diverse treatments. Some individuals were interred in stone-lined chambers, others in simpler pits. Yet grave goods range from modest to relatively elaborate in ways that do not form a clear hierarchy, suggesting that cultural norms or household economies shifted over time. Small finds, shell beads likely traded from far coasts, textile fragments preserved in dry pockets, carved lids, metal ornaments, attest to wider connections and local craft production. But their uneven distribution raises questions about how consistently trade networks shaped burial practice. Environmental reconstruction suggests that during the city's peak, water was more accessible than it is today, supporting fields and wells that sustained a substantial population. As climate change reduced water availability, mortuary practices may also have shifted, contributing to the uneven chronological signals seen across the necropolis. Remote sensing reveals faint rectilinear shadows beneath the sand that may represent additional tombs or boundary walls. Until excavated, their roles remain speculative. Within exposed chambers, soot deposits on ceilings suggest reopening in antiquity, perhaps for secondary burials, maintenance of ancestral plots, or rituals whose meaning is lost. Mixed deposits in some contexts further complicate the interpretation of original sequences. The relationship between the necropolis and the city's religious life remains difficult to define. While inscriptions and temple remains in the urban center attest to organized ritual practices, the diversity of tomb forms at the cemetery suggests a complex interplay of local traditions, regional influences, and evolving identities across centuries. Geological constraints add another layer. Tombs anchored in bedrock survive differently than those built in looser sediments, creating a misleading contrast in apparent craftsmanship or age. Occasional anomalies, incomplete chambers, passages ending abruptly, stones reused from older structures, reflect abandoned building phases, later modifications, or repairs rather than sudden cultural transformations. As research continues, the tombs reveal enough to outline a society navigating trade, environment, and internal hierarchy, but not enough to reconstruct the full evolution of its mortuary traditions. In the end, the Carriot Alpha tomb stand is a quiet, intricate testament to a community both present and dissolved, preserved in stone yet partly erased by desert winds. Their story is neither dramatic nor fully complete, but offers a measured sense of inquiry shaped by the interplay of memory, environment, and the uneven survival of a mortuary landscape whose endurance anchors one more fragment of an ancient city's long, partly illuminated history. Beyond the necropolis, the desert opens into a wide, almost muted expanse where wind drifts settle into soft ridges that shift from month to month, subtly reconfiguring the approaches to the ancient city. What remains of Alpha's outskirts is faint. Traces of low walls, scattered platforms, and barely discernible depressions marking where gardens or small outbuildings once stood. These peripheral features offer only glimpses of the lived environment surrounding the urban core, for erosion has blurred their outlines and later sediment has sealed many beneath layers of wind-blown sand. Yet the very faintness of these remains hints at a landscape used flexibly, shaped by agricultural rhythms, pastoral movement, and the slow expansion and contraction of domestic space over generations. To the south and east, archaeologists have documented remnants of long-abandoned fields where faint check lines and subtle differences in soil color indicate ancient irrigation channels. These systems appear to have drawn water from wells now buried or collapsed, and their spatial distribution suggests a changing perimeter of cultivation as communities adapted to fluctuating water tables. Some areas show evidence of deliberate soil improvement through the addition of gravel or organic matter, while others seem abruptly abandoned, leaving only ghost patterns detectable from aerial surveys. Attempts to correlate these shifts with known climatic fluctuations produce broad alignments, but not precise sequences, reinforcing the sense that environmental change and human decision-making interacted in ways too nuanced to fully disentangle. Closer to the city's core, isolated refuse deposits reveal layers of domestic consumption, broken pottery, animal bones, and plant remains compressed by time into small mounds that once marked activity zones near markets or communal gathering points. These mounds, though limited in scale, hint at the everyday rhythms that rarely survive in monumental ruins. Their contents show dietary preferences shifting with trade cycles, moments of scarcity, or cultural transitions, though pinning specific causes to each variation remains speculative. The absence of extensive midden fields, common in other ancient settlements, may indicate that waste disposal here was more dispersed or that later occupation disturbed earlier deposits beyond recognition. Traces of craft reduction appear intermittently across the outskirts. Small scatters of slag, fragments of clay molds, and stones bearing signs of polishing or drilling. Yet these materials seldom coalesce into clearly defined industrial zones, suggesting that specialized activities were distributed across the settlement rather than centralized. This diffusion complicates efforts to reconstruct economic structures, for the archaeological signature workshops is faint and often overlaid by later phases of use. Still, the presence of artisans, metalworkers, bead makers, potters can be inferred from the diversity of objects recovered in both residential and funerary contexts. Further out, researchers occasionally encounter small cairns, stone alignments, and low mounds whose functions remain uncertain. They may have served as territorial markers, waypoints, or ritual stations tied to seasonal movement, though insufficient material survives to clarify their roles. Their placement, sometimes aligned with distant hills or former water sources, hints at a landscape once embedded with meaning, now readable only in fragments. In a few places, faint trails appear as shallow linear depressions across the gravel plain, possibly remnants of caravan paths linking AlUla to neighboring oases. The durability of these tracks varies, shaped by erosion and sedimentation, leaving incomplete traces that nonetheless evoke centuries of movement through the region. Occasional inscriptions etched onto scattered boulders, sometimes no more than a few words or names, introduce small human signatures into the open terrain. These texts, weathered but still recognizable, imply routes of travel or locations of brief encampments, yet they rarely correspond to larger archaeological features. Their isolation strengthens the impression of a landscape inhabited intermittently, claimed and reclaimed by shifting groups whose traces remain muted. Even in areas where nothing is visible on the surface, remote sensing detects subtle anomalies, rectilinear shadows beneath the sand, faint geometric patterns suggesting buried walls or courtyards. Their existence confirms that the preserved city represents only a portion of its former expanse. But without excavation, these hints remain suspended between possibility and confirmation. And so the outskirts of AlUla, like its necropolis and urban core, persist as a partially legible palimpsest, shaped by human intention, environmental change, and the long, patient work of desert winds.